Hi everyone, it's Kelly from the Hub, here today with my dad, the master woodworker himself. Hello there, Father, how are you?
Hi. Getting used to fall.
Yeah, it's uh it's the season.
It's cold here. It's 64 degrees here.
Yeah, for heaven's sakes, if you were down in balmy Pennsylvania, it would be a nice balmy 75, I think it is today.
Wow. Yeah, well, we're here by the lake. The lake is our air conditioner.
That's that's right. Some of that cold air from Canada coming on down.
You
So
got it.
today we're taking a tour of your workshop.
Today we're doing a workshop tour, although I said to myself, if I took the iPad and went down and walked around the basement with the video thing going and tried to show all the bright spots where I've got LED lights that'll blow out your whatever your lens, or all the little dark little corners and all the dust and crust and whatever, that wouldn't have been good. So what I did is I took some pictures and made a slideshow. So we'll have a little slideshow presentation of the workshop today, including a few how things are done kind of videos.
Excellent. I think this is really cool because then all the things that people have thought about and wondered about, and even for those people who do this, I think people who do this themselves are like, oh, I wonder what his equipment looks like, because it's like wrenches and all those other things. Everyone wants to compare how cool theirs is to how cool somebody else's is. So
Only guys do that.
yeah, probably. All right, show us.
Is my lathe bigger than yours?
Right, it's right. How big is your lathe?
You'll have to wait and see. Although I think you're assuming that people are wondering about this stuff, and I'm not so sure that that's true. Because for me, the discussions about the design and all those kind of details, for me, that's the interesting stuff. And this stuff and that's also sort of a little romantic. Like you're looking at this piece and you go,
yes,
oh my God, that used to be a gnarly, ugly old piece of wood, and now it's shiny and graceful and whatever.
right.
And that's for me, that's the cool stuff. And about which tool you use and how many cubic feet per minute your dust collector blows and all that sort of stuff. It's like, really, like, who cares about that?
There are lots of kinds of people, and some of those people like to need that stuff too.
We'll see. Maybe I'll just scroll through the slides at super fast speed, and if you got it, you got it. If you didn't, oh well, it doesn't matter.
Right. You can watch it again. Right.
All right. Are we ready to share the slideshow?
Yep. Show us.
Here we go. Ta-da.
Ta-da. Perfect.
So you can't see me, right? You can just hear me.
I can see you. You are in a little tiny screen. You're in a little tiny block on the side.
Okay. All right. So the Woodturner's workshop. So the first thing the first two things that every woodturner has to have are a lathe, which is that big gray thing over there on the right. I'll come back there in a minute. And if you did all the work on a lathe without having a dust collector, which is that thing that says Rikon on it with the red stars. So if you didn't have a dust collector going all the time, your whole house, upstairs as well as in the basement, would be full of dust, fine dust, mostly from sanding, I suppose. And you'll notice that, so the red stars show, that's the filter bag up there on the left, high left. And then the star in the middle shows where the hose goes down and disappears up and comes up behind the lathe in a different color thing that's flexible, but just rigid enough so that it stays where you bend it. And you bend that over by the piece you're working on, and that collects the dust. So, and then the lathe. So we'll see some more close-up pictures of the lathe in a minute. And that stool, which came from my father's workshop, it's been repaired about 10 times. Sometimes when I'm working on a piece, if it's fine work, I'll sit down on that and put my foot up on the footrest and work hard, get up close to the piece. But I would guess most of the time, probably more than half the time when I'm working on the lathe, I'm standing up. So my junky basement. Okay, and everybody, you got to have some tools. So there's my main tool rack. And in a minute, or a few minutes, we'll come back and I'll show you. I took some of those off of there and I'll show you what those things are used for. That's probably about 3/4 of my tools.
And that's also because you've been doing this for a long time. You
Yeah.
don't have to start out with all the nuances. You've realized what tools you need, what tools you want to have versions of, thicker, thinner, all those kinds of things.
Right.
And so you added tools as you went.
Right. And I continue every once in a while. I still will buy a new tool every once in a while. I used to buy some tools in antique shops and stuff, but they've really dried up. I haven't found a tool in an antique shop or a flea market or anything for 5 years. But if you look at that picture, if you can see well enough, in the bottom left-hand corner, on the far left, there's a little mallet, a little wooden mallet hanging there. And the next one over is a big heavy oak mallet that's got rawhide on both faces that was put on there wet and shrunk apparently. And that also came from my father's workshop. So that it's a useful tool, but it's big and clunky. So that's why I made the sort of the smaller one over there. That's nowhere near as useful, but anyhow. And so everything in between, you know, I've got stuff from my father and I've got stuff that I bought just a few months ago. Okay, so of course, besides tools, you got to have wood. So here's 3 pictures of 3 different places in my basement. And this is only a small percentage of the pieces of wood that I have in storage. On the top right is some planks that I sawed out of boards that I used to make, you know, remember the plate that I showed you that was all made out of bricks? Well, that's where those came from. And you see lots of round stuff that's already been sawed out on the bandsaw, so ready to put on, some walnut pieces right there in the middle. Below that, you see some really rough and raggedy pieces that have hollow ant work in the middle, carpenter ants in the middle. One with a single hole. I don't know if you can read or not, but there's maple knots there, apple. There's a piece of California redwood on the right that has a remarkable line between the sapwood and the heartwood. There's spalted ash. There's all kinds of stuff. And then on the left, those little shopping bags that are hanging there from a homemade hanger. Those are full of driftwood pieces and stuff that I picked up in the woods or on the beach, different places and different trips and whatever. So every one of those, and driftwood in the boxes, some of them are labeled Driftwood, Georgia, and whatever. So if I feel like making a bowl, sometimes if I don't have an idea, I go downstairs and just sit there and stand there and look at the shelf and say, okay, which one of these pieces am I going to use today? And start from there. So here's the lathe. So this is the on the left side of the lathe that you saw on the first slide, the part that's got the motor inside, that's called the headstock. And that's where the wood spins. That's where you do most of your work. The black thing on there is called a chuck. I've been talking about the chuck ever since the first or second episode. I have 3 or 4 different ones and for different purposes and different sizes. So that's a small one. And you can see I just put a piece of a dowel in there. So if I felt like making a spindle, I'm making a finial for something, I could just take a dowel or any piece of wood that I could grab a hold of with that chuck and put it in there. And it would be real easy. I wouldn't have to do anything else just to make a finial. And then when I was done, I just cut it off on the bottom, make the make a little tail on it, the size that I wanted to stick in the hole on the lid, and then just cut it off. I can sand it right there, do everything right there in place. And the gray thing, the gray straight line thing there is the tool rest. So remember, when the wood is spinning, the tool has to be stationary, and there's a lot of torque sometimes. It has to be resting on something. So that's where you rest your tool. So you can make a little finial out of that, or if you have a fence outside and you got posts in the corner and you want to put fancy finials on the posts, I made this for a neighbor. I made a couple of them, several of them to match. So you just take an old piece of 4x4 and make a fancy finial to put on the corner post of your fence. So pretty easy. And where the chuck is gripping it, there will be a tail there. It's called a tenon. That's where it's being gripped, but that's also where, when you're ready to use that, you just drill a hole in the top of the post, squirt it full of glue, and stick that tenon down in the hole. So there you go. And you can see the dust collector nozzle is right there, ready to suck away the dust. All right. Now, so here's the headstock with that same chuck, except now instead of gripping it, contracting to grip it, this one is expanding to grip it. There's a hole in the back, and it's expanded inside that hole. I'll show you a close-up of it somewhere along the way. So if I wanted to make a lid out of this piece, I can start right there and make the lid. All right, we'll come back to something like that in a minute. So this is called turning between centers. And if you remember back first or second episode, I showed you the back scratcher that I made the long handle for. So if you wanted to make a long handle for something, the spindle to repair a chair, a very small baseball bat, or whatever, this would be the way you'd set things up. That's just a dowel and a long piece of dowel in there. If you want something bigger diameter, of course, then you'd have to make something of your own, but it would be mounted like that. Now look over on the left, and you'll see this is called a SPUR center, because it has 4 little sharp spurs on there and a point in the middle. And that's what you drill a little hole in your piece of wood and whack that piece of wood a couple of times with a wooden mallet so that those spurs actually dig into the wood just a little bit. And then when you turn on the lathe, that causes the thing to spin. So that's how you drive the piece. The other end of the lathe is called the tailstock, and it's adjustable in 2 or 3 different ways. And that cone-shaped thing on there is called a live center. And the reason it's called live is because it has ball bearings inside, which allow that piece to spin with the wood. So if it didn't spin, it would burn the wood, because there's pressure on there to hold it, and you have to keep tightening it up. And as you tighten it up and the wood is spinning, it would burn, it would char the wood. Wouldn't set it on fire, but it gets pretty hot and it would burn the wood. So they make this live center that has ball bearings in it, and it spins with the wood to make it so there's no resistance and whatever. So there you go. All right. We've talked a couple of times before about how do you finish a lid on both sides. So one of the weird things about turning wood, the first weird thing is that the pieces that you make on a lathe are all lying down instead of standing up. So when you make a bowl, you stand it on the table, but when you make it on the lathe, it's lying down 90 degrees off from where you're going to use it. So that's hard to get used to for some people. It's just one of those spatial perception things. But the other thing is that on a lathe, when you're making a piece on a lathe that's hollow, at least, you almost always have to make the bottom first. And that seems kind of weird to people. It seems backwards. But remember, the bottom is how you hold it. So you make the bottom first so you can hold it. and then you finish the hollowing in the top. Well, here's a lid that's been made, and that's the bottom, the inside of the lid. And it always is a good idea when you're turning a lid to make a shoulder, a ring around it like that, that's got a little bit of depth to it. And you'll see in a minute why. Because that's how you're going to hold the lid in order to finish it. So you make the lid. It may or may not be finished on the top, or maybe you want to do something else. So you have to figure out how to grip this. So here's how you do it. So on the left, you take a scrap of, it's like an old fat 2x4, and you drill a hole in the middle of it that you can grip with the chuck. So I've got bits that are big, all the way up to 2 inches. So this is a small one for this small chuck. So you drill a hole in there, and then on the right, it shows how I'm ready to mount that scrap of wood that's sawed out round on the bandsaw with a hole in the middle. I'm going to mount it on the chuck. I'm going to put it in there. I'm going to put the chuck in that hole, and then I'm going to tighten up the chuck. Now, the next thing I need to do is figure out how big I need to make this thing in order to hold the lid. So on the left-hand side, I'm measuring with the caliper how wide that ring is on there. And you notice the caliper has jaws on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, it has these 2 points. And people look at that and go, what the hell is that for? And on the right-hand side, it's obvious what it's for, because the width of the points is the same exact width as the width between the jaws. So I see if it's, I can't read it, but maybe 2 1/4 inches wide. So the points measure 2 1/4 inches. So then on the right-hand side, I'm transferring that measurement onto the block that I just made and mounted on the chuck. And the confusing part about this for people is that I didn't realize until afterwards. I should have showed how you take a pencil and you draw a ring on the block. This shows exactly how wide that is. So on the left, you take a tool, shape the right shape, and you cut a groove into that scrap piece. And the groove has to be exactly right. Has to be the right. It can be too deep, but it can't be too shallow. It has to be exactly the right diameter. It has to be exactly the right width, because what you're going to do, this is called a jam fit. And the reason it's called a jam fit is you take the top, once that groove is right, you have to try it. I tried this, like, I was just making a demonstration here. And I tried that. It took me about 3 times of fussing around to get that groove just the right size. So then you take the lid and you jam it in there, and it has to fit real tight. If it doesn't fit tight, you can do 2 things. You can start all over again, or you can take a roll of masking tape and put a couple pieces of masking tape on the lid, and that'll make it fit tighter in the groove. So once that lid is jammed in to that groove, as the picture on the right shows, then as soon as you turn on the lathe and the lid will spin, you can work on it, you can cut it, you can sand it, you can do all kinds of things, you can drill a hole in it, you can do all kinds of things to it. And if it fits in there right, it won't move, it'll hold very securely. So all the time before, if you were wondering about finishing the lid, that's how. I remember I showed you that big funeral jar that I made, funeral urn, and this is how I made the inlays in the lid. I made a jam fit, jammed it in there. I made the bottom of the lid first and jammed it in there, and it was all rough and weird on the top. I've been holding it on the top. So then I cut off this extra scrap on the top and made those 2 inlay pieces, the walnut ring and the spalted maple disc in the middle, and then sanded it all off. And it was all done, and it looks like that picture on the right. I don't know, is that clear?
It is.
You get that?
So you're right. This takes all the mystery away. But I think, for me, now I really get it.
Yeah.
I mean, I like the mystery, but I know that there are people who are like, I want to see the, like, you know, because it's like magic. So they want to know, how do you do the magic trick?
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is a little bit like a magician showing off what's in the hat,
Yeah.
but
But it's
still, you know,
cool.
it still is not, it still isn't completely mechanical, you know, sort of in defense of the maker. It's not completely a mechanical process from here. So whatever I'm going to do to this lid over here is going to take some design, and it's going to take some planning, and it's going to take some accuracy and some skill and whatever in order to get it to work and look good. So yeah, it takes a lot of the mystery out. But I just want to make it clear. All right. So sometimes people wonder, well, so you're turning this piece on the lathe. How do you know how thin it is? How do you know when to quit? So this shows a bowl that's already been made, and I put it back on the lathe. And the big shiny thing that I'm holding in my hand is a caliper, double-ended caliper. And it's, you don't have to be a geometry whiz to understand that if both arms of the caliper are shaped exactly the same size and shape, and it's jointed in the center where that brass thumb screw is, that whatever the distance is between the ends on the left-hand side, you're going to get exactly the same distance between the ends on the right-hand side. So you insert that into it can be a hole that can only be 1/4 of an inch wide, a tiny hole. This hole is about 1.5 inches. It's pretty small, but that'll insert into anything, almost anything that you can make, and you tighten it up. Yeah, and then you look over on the right, and that tells you how thick the wall is. So that's about 1/4, 3/8 of an inch thick. So there are people who turn down to, I've seen people turn even stuff this big. I've seen people turn that down to almost 1/8 of an inch, and it's extremely delicate and extremely time consuming, but it makes for a wonderful piece, because you look at this piece, which is 8 or 10 inches in diameter, and you expect it's going to weigh 1 pound or 2, and you pick it up and it weighs about as much as an empty glass. It's like, whoa, that is thin.
Yeah.
But some people specialize in thin. Thin is hard. Thin is very hard. So that's how you do thin. And as an example, so one day I was working on this nice cherry bowl, and the picture on the left shows it has this real interesting lopsided natural rim, pretty wood. And I even planned, the picture on the right, I planned, because there was a knot in there, I said, well, I'm going to turn that down till it's thin enough that that knot opens up into a hole. And I would have a nice big window shaped hole in the side. So I'm working away at it, and I got it to this point, and I said, that's pretty good. I think I'll stop there. That hole's about what I want it to be. You can see it's less than 1/4 of an inch thick. It's a pretty thin piece. And so they said, well, now all I got to do is turn the bottom a little thinner, and we're done. All of a sudden, something didn't seem quite right. When I was turning, there was this weird shadow down in the bottom, and I turned off the lathe, and there it is. I should have used the caliper on the bottom, because I cut a hole right through the bottom. So that piece goes in the scrap pile, but it sits up on a shelf by my lathe. It sits there all the time. I had to blow about 1/4 of an inch of dust out of it in order to take this picture. As a reminder to me to be careful.
Yep.
Because you can make the wood thinner, but you can't make it thicker. So if you want to make it longer, like you cut a board, you want to make it longer, sorry, you got to do a new board. You can make it shorter, but you can't make it longer. It's the same thing. So that's how you know how thin something is, and that's how you make a dumb mistake. So whatever. Just so you know, another thing about, since we're demystifying the whole process, not everything a person does is perfect. Sometimes you do something and it's screwed up. So you start again.
Right,
because
and
this
that's also the, measure twice, cut once kind of a thing that,
yeah,
that still applies
right,
in this
right.
type of process as well.
Yeah,
And
it's like you're making soup and you add too much salt.
right, then you just have to,
I can't take the salt out,
you,
so what
right,
do you do?
right. So you either have
And
a giant hole or a creative hole or extra scrap.
well, actually, you could fix this, but if you fixed it, it would be very visible and very noticeable. And everybody who looked at it, who knew anything, would say, oh, something weirdly wrong with that. It's like, why does he have this circle of a different piece of wood right in the middle of the bottom? It's like, that's a weird decoration,
Yep.
you know. So you could make it look like a decoration if you wanted to, but it would still look weird because it would be right in the middle of the bottom, and most people would know that it was a mistake. All right. Tools. I told you we'd do the tools.
Woohoo!
These are some of my father's lathe tools. And I hadn't looked at these very close for a long time. They say buck on the one dead center says buck on the blade, and the second one from the top says buck on the handle. Buck is a company that still makes knives, the Buck Knife Company. But these tools, you notice the handles all match except the one on the top is a little bit different. I think the one on the top is one I probably made when I was a kid,
Huh.
because it probably didn't have a handle or the handle was broken or something. And I think I might have made that handle. It almost matches, the style matches, but it's not exactly the same. So these tools have to be from at least the 40s or 50s. So they're that old. They're as old as me. All right, several different kinds of tools. These are called scrapers. And scrapers are made from flat pieces of steel. So the one on the top was my father's with an antique oak handle and a brass ferrule. So that's an old timer. That's called a skew scraper. Then the one in the middle is one that I made myself. When I was a teacher, there was a machine shop in my high school, and I was friends with the machine shop teacher. And somewhere I realized that I could take an old file and grind the teeth off of it with a professional. It'd take you forever to do that at home on a grinding wheel, and it wouldn't be flat. So I made that myself using the surface grinder in the machine shop, and cut the end and then ground a sharp thing on the end. The one on the bottom is relatively new, not an expensive tool, but a nice heavy tool. So these are called scrapers because since they're flat, when you hold them up against the wood, actually what you're doing is scraping the pieces of wood, the little pieces of wood, the little shavings, you're scraping them off. Now, why is that different? These are called gouges. And you can see each one of these has a groove down the middle. So these are made out of curved pieces of steel. Actually, they're flat pieces of steel that are ground out that way, but they look like they're curved pieces of steel. So the second one from the bottom and the third one from the bottom, actually those three on the bottom are all my father's tools as well. The second one and the third one have flat faces. So they're only curved in 2 dimensions, but all the other ones are round in 3 dimensions. So the point is, when you hold that, this is going to take a little bit of spatial visual perception, but when you hold that tool on the tool rest and move it against the wood, since the surface of the tool is curved in all 3 dimensions, what it does is it actually shears the wood off rather than scraping it. So if you can get a picture of what that would look like at the point where the tool meets the wood, it actually shears it off like scissors rather than scraping it off like a scraper of some kind. So those are called scrapers. These are my miniature tools. So you can see the mark of that stainless steel ruler up there, a little hard to read, but those tools are about 8 or 9 inches long. And the one on the top is a set of 3 very modern little miniature tools with interchangeable cutters. One's flat, one's pointed, and one's curved. Then the 5 in the middle is a set of tools that I bought. I use those, especially the 3 on the top. I use those all the time for doing small things. And then the 3 on the bottom are a round, a square, and a pointed little carbide cutter that my friend, the machine shop teacher, gave me. And you can see they're only about 3 inches, 4 inches long. They're so small. When you're working on a small piece, you don't even really have to have a handle. A handle's for leverage and balance and to cut vibration. If you're working on a small piece, you don't even really need a handle. So I just hold those in my hand. That one of those tiny little tools is the one that I told you, maybe you asked, how do you get those little grooves in the surface of the piece? In this example, they're in the cut in the foot. And how I do it is just hold that little tiny square face tool up there and cut them away until I get deep enough, and then just sand them out and done. Voila. Oops.
Cool.
Bump the thing. All right. And the last kind of tools, these are hollowing tools. The hollowing tools are always curved because when you hollow something out, if it's a big wide open ball, not necessarily so much, you can use almost any tool to do that. But if it's a vase with a hole that's smaller than the diameter of the vase, then you need to be able to reach under the rim to hollow it back underneath the rim. And that's why they're curved. So the 3 on the top are sophisticated tools with the second one has a carbide tip, little tiny carbide tip. The third one is very aggressive with a tip sticking out there like a thumb. The fourth one down is another one that I made myself, looks like the last one. And then the bottom one you've seen before, a little miniature tool for hollowing that has a little hook-shaped thing, and it's sharp all the way around the end, so it'll cut on three of the 3 sides will cut. So that's what you use to hollow something out. And this is the biggest hollowing tool that I have. I bought this one. It's weird, kind of that red thing. It looks like a spring wrapped around there. But you see, this tool is over 28 inches long. It weighs about 2 or 3 pounds.
Wow.
And you can work a long way deep away from the tool rest with this because the handle is so heavy that it balances it and damps the vibration. And it's, whoops, I'm sorry, I keep bumping this thing. It damps the vibration, and you can see the steel thing on the end there is only curved a little bit. So you use a different tool to cut back under the rim, and then you use this to go way down deep into the piece. That funerary urn that I made, that's about 10 inches deep, I worked on the whole urn with this cutter. So big boy. So the tools go everywhere from 28 inches and 3 pounds down to 4 inches and just a couple ounces. There are a couple specialty tools. So when you're making a finial, those spool things on there, like on a spool bed, those are called beads, like a genuine bed. And there's tools that make it easy to cut the same bead size over and over and over again. So you see the one on the left, it looks like there's 4 beads on there, and those 4 beads were cut with 4 different size tools. But if I wanted to make the one bead over and over and over again, it'd be real easy to use that tool to make it. It measures it out, spaces it out. You turn it till it starts to get completely round, and then you stop and use another tool to smooth it out. And then on the same finial, you'll see that you don't want to have, on this one, I didn't want to have sharp, pointy spaces between the beads. I wanted to have graceful curved spaces. So I use that little tool over there on the right in order to smooth out the spaces in between the beads. That make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. And you made fun of me one day because, like you said, I had friends in the city maintenance department that cut the trees.
Yep.
Another friend reminded me the other day that those city guys have maybe 3 times I've come home from being gone somewhere and found a big piece of wood on my porch that the city guys dropped it off. They knew that there's something I want, and they drop it off. Well, on some of those really rugged pieces that we've seen before, the pieces with the bark and the holes or whatever, a lot of times the cracks in those things are full of bark, and the bark is kind of soft and it's flaky and it's coming out. So one day I said to my dentist, "You got any of those old picks, the ones, you jam down in my gums and make me flinch and whatever, the ones that you torture me with? You got any old ones that are like you don't use them anymore because they're not sharp enough? I could probably use those." And he said, "Yeah, here." He says, I'll give you some." And he rummaged around in his drawer and he gave me these 3. And that's what I use sometimes to pick the sawdust out of ant holes, wormholes, to pick the bark out of cracks, to scrape. Well, the one on the top and the first 2 are very good at scraping the bark out of a crack. So you open it up and make it look a lot better than it did with weird stuff in there. All right.
Who would have thought?
So, almost the last piece. The last slide. You talked before about finishing. So I made these 2 slides. I took these 9 different pieces of wood, a different species on the left, and just cut them small and sanded them off a little bit. So you can see what they look like when they're just sanded. And then I put my favorite Danish oil on them and took a second picture, and that's the ones on the right. So to get the idea here, look at the spalted maple in the top left corner, the raw wood, and then look at the spalted maple on the right, in the top left corner of the right picture, and see the difference that the finishing makes. For me, one of the more dramatic ones here is that piece of maple, which looks white almost, and you can't hardly see that there's anything there. And then you put oil on it on the top right-hand corner, and you see it brings out the stripes. And that particular piece of maple has stripes going both directions almost. And the dark ones that are vertical makes that what's called quilted maple, because it looks like sort of a quilt or a piece of fabric that's folded, almost like it has shadows in it. So you can see the oil makes the walnut piece look almost black. It brings out some of the detail in the oak, turns the mulberry round. That's an end grain piece of mulberry, turns that really, really dark. And you can see the other one that's pretty dramatic is the wild cherry in the middle. I think I used to call that choke cherry. And the black cherry on its right, which is a complicated piece with a bark on the edge and stuff. So how it brings out the color. Sometimes it almost will hide, like with that piece of cedar, red cedar, it makes it so dark that it almost hides the details.
Yeah.
But after it sits for a while and soaks in and you wax it a little bit and whatever, then the details will come back. And this is what I oil with.
That's really neat because it shows you how you can see the grain so much differently, and how it and how it treats wood. I mean, it does what it does. The oil does what it does, but you can see how it warms up the cherry, and it really it warms up most of the wood.
Yeah, it's the difference between a fluorescent light and an incandescent light.
Yeah.
If you're a photographer or if you're just sensitive to that light of around you, incandescent lights make things look green, or LED lights sometimes make things look almost blue.
Yep.
Like the pieces on the left, but incandescent lights are warmer, yellower, more orange and yellow light make stuff look like on the right. So when I photograph my pieces, I almost always try to use some natural light, but some incandescent light too, because it makes them look warmer.
Yeah.
So this is the oil I use. I've been using it for years. Watco Danish oil. You can get it in Home Depot or any place, I think. And it comes in colors. So if you had access to nothing but maple or ash and you wanted to make it look a little darker, you could buy this in a darker color and it would make the wood a little bit darker. So that's it, and here I am. The tour of the wood shop is over.
I have to say,
Hope you learned something.
it's, even though I've been in your basement lots of times and I've seen you do stuff, it still is always so neat to see all the parts.
Yeah.
And it's also one of those, you know, every hobbyist gets excited about their craft, whether it's embroidery or gardening or whatever. And so it's cool to see how all the parts fit together. I just think that's just fascinating. And
Yep.
I also, I mean, you know, so you're my dad, so I know these things, but I also really love that. And I think a lot of people who are real hobbyists about stuff, who are serious about their hobby, you know, they have old parts of it, they have new parts, they can combine all of those things together to create the best version of their craft. And
Well,
I just think that's fascinating.
I know painters have their favorite brushes.
Yep, absolutely. That they've had for
And
25 years. Yeah.
yeah, calligraphers have their favorite pens, and you know, whatever. Sculptors probably have their favorite. I know I do a little bit of stonework, and I know that sculptors, people who work in stone, have their favorite hammers and their favorite chisels, and you know, whatever. So, you know, those tools of the trade are important. Of course, you know, the tools only do part of the work. So.
Right. You have to be the craftsperson to
Right.
allow the tool to do what it does, or to manipulate the tool to do something that you want it to do.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I have to say, Dad, this was great. Dad's got 2 slideshows he's going to show us next time.
Okay.
There's some little pieces that he hasn't shown you yet. He's just keeping. And I'll just wet your whistle with this one. Remember at the beginning when he said, I have this piece of ugly wood. He has something to show you about the ugly wood.
Surprise, surprise.
That's right. Pops, it was wonderful to chat with you as always. Thank you for pulling back the curtain and showing us some of the stuff that's no longer mysterious.
You're welcome, and this probably was the shortest one to date, so people will be happy about that.
Thanks, Dad. See you next
Okay,
week,
see you guys.
everybody.
Bye.